Beautiful. I had a question for you.
Yeah.
If you could give some words to the difference between, or what might be the difference between unnecessary boundaries and necessary boundaries, or maybe even temporary necessary boundaries while we're working towards the ultimate unnecessary boundary state.
Well, it's a great question. Thank you for that question. Yeah, because when I'm talking about letting go of the boundaries, I'm talking about the boundaries that enclose the heart. That's really what I'm getting at. The boundaries that we enclose the heart behind. This doesn't mean, however, that there is situations, sometimes there's people where you part of life is sometimes needing to establish certain kind of boundaries. Wise parents will establish certain boundaries with their children, and if you go to work, there's going to be certain boundaries. Sometimes you have to establish certain boundaries around, very, very reactive people. But those are kind of practical boundaries, and those come out. That's part of what I was including within the ability to discern and be wise. Because if we just thought, well, all boundaries are off, that's kind of a misunderstanding would be a misunderstanding of really what I'm trying to get at. Because like I said, sometimes you do need to establish boundaries, because some people, or situations they're just not, they don't have respect maybe for you, or maybe they're dangerous, maybe they're, there's different reasons why we might see that it's necessary to create certain boundaries. But even if we create boundaries, that doesn't mean that we have to put boundaries around our heart. That doesn't mean that we have to withhold love. That doesn't mean that we have to sort of create this deep and profound sense of otherness, that we can, from wisdom and experience, we can see when and where we need to create practical boundaries, you might say, and when we don't need to have those boundaries, but all the while realizing that no matter whether we need to make a practical boundary or not, we don't have to close our heart off. We close our heart off at our own expense, right? So, as I say, sometimes you do need to say no in life. That's a kind of boundary. But when the no comes from a deeply wise place, the no is always an expression of a kind of a deeper yes. In other words, when we say no from a wise place, we may be saying yes to the necessity for respect, or for safety, or for, some other kind of wise boundary. That in other words, even if you have to have a boundary, if it comes from a deep place, the boundary itself can be an expression of something wise, right? And the practical boundary does not mean that we therefore have to close our heart. I think that's the really important part that I want to convey as well. That we often think, well, if I have to create a practical boundary with someone, that I necessarily need to close my heart off with them and get judgmental and go into blame and all those other sort of conflicted emotions. I would really look at that. I would really look and see sometimes we do need practical boundaries, but do we actually need to cut our heart off? Our connection? Do we actually need to disconnect on that essential level, right? So practical boundaries are different than the boundaries of the heart, where we're protecting usually our idea of ourselves. Right? So I hope I made that distinction clear between the practical boundaries and the fact that it's at times necessary to have them, but we can always stay connected. Even in very, very challenging situations, you can still decide not to, inside yourself, disconnect your heart. Because when you disconnect it from somebody else, to a certain extent, you disconnect it from yourself.